Welcome to RADIONOKO, a series of podcasts relating to all things concerning NOKO 210, a collaboration between Scott Barnes and myself, Barry William Hale. We'll be talking about up-and-coming performances, previous events, theoretical concepts relating to the production of the work, and various matters arising. So I think it's pertinent to begin with some of our recent engagements, and I think the most significant engagement in recent history is NOKO 210's performances or series of performances at Dark Mofo, which was part of Invisible House, curated by Brendan Walls at the Salamanca Arts Centre in conjunction with Australia's largest art festival in Hobart, Tasmania. So, Scott, do you want to say a few things about our exhibition and engagement at Dark Mofo?
The Salamanca Invisible House installation was a very important location for our project. In some ways, it was allowing us to put to bed the long-running Hypercube project and not only exhibit 2D works and research materials by Barry in the space for a period of 2 weeks, but also to present around 20 performances over that time, showcasing works from Hypercube 210 and also from the Enoch 21 newer recorded work that we've produced. There was a huge amount of people that came through. There was
over 6,000.
There was a positive response not only to our work but the other performances and exhibited works.
Well, the other exhibited works included Brendan Wall's Tohu v Bohu, which was an installation with a series of different performances. There was also work that was exhibited from the Stephen Romano Gallery, which was William Mortensen, major collection of his photographs. There was also Ajahn Orr, who is a Thai Ajahn, who was doing magical tattooing upstairs. So it was a pretty... and then we also had a series of Harry Smith's films.
Well, that's right. Jack Sargent's curation of the Harry Smith stuff, and that had some live performance as well with various musicians who were working with
so
that.
In all, it was a very satisfying and exciting event.
Yeah, it was like nothing else that I've taken part in with the NOKO project in terms of the scope of having the 10-day or more time period and placing those performances throughout that time. It was nice to know that the technology there with the PA was right. We didn't have to worry like for a one-off show. Once we knew the setup was right, we were really just able to produce the work in the way that we wanted to be able to show it to the audience, which was really good.
Yeah, that's correct. And another engagement that concerns the project is an up-and-coming Music, Magic and the MUSE. And this is a series of lectures and lectures and recitals at the Larry Sitsky Recital Room at ANU School of Music, Canberra, Australia, on the 16th of February from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. So that's the whole day. And we'll have a recital of by Thor Thromher. So his name, F-O-R-M-Y-H-R. He's going to be doing Layla Waddell's Tone Testament, and people might be familiar with Layla Waddell and a relationship to Aleister Crowley's Magical Order, the AA, and very significant figure in Thalamic Discourse. Also, there will be a recital by Edward Neiman, who will be playing the 7 parts of the Golden Dawn Suite of Larry Sitsky, one of Australia's most celebrated composers. And the interesting thing here is that each of those 7 parts of the suite are named after, are taken from the Enochian language or the angelic language of Dr. John D. I'll be giving a lecture down there entitled Angelic Agency, the Influence of John D's Enochian Magical System on Art and Magic, from Aleister Crowley's Thelemic Apocalypse to Larry Sitsky's Golden Dawn. Other lectures will include Mother of Heaven by Cynthia Cross, who is currently writing a biography on Layla Waddell, coming from New Zealand, and Esotericism in Music and the Australian Theosophical Music Scene by Dr. Fraser. So it's an interesting event, and I'd encourage everyone to come down. Also, I'll be doing a series of projections and for the Golden Dawn Suite, and introducing each of the 7 suites and explaining a little bit about the names used.
Yeah, and Larry Sitsky is not only one of Australia's best-known 20th century composers, he's also one of the few composers who's working with sonifying esoteric data as part of his compositional technique. So that's quite relevant, obviously, to some of our interests working with NOKO.
Oh, yeah, I wanted to mention that Larry Sitsky is being interviewed by HIEROS GAMOS Radio for the up-and-coming event, and we might put a link in the... We'll put a link.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
Yeah, we'll put some links. We still haven't decided exactly what format we'll do. We'll probably do a number of formats for Radio Noko. And
so that's the 16th of February.
16th of February.
Yeah, that's right. At the Larry Sitsky Recital Hall in
Canberra, ANU.
Yeah.
9 to 5, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of interesting people to talk to. The other thing that might be well mentioning, Scott, is our latest releases on Bandcamp.
Well, that's right. We've got 7 of the tracks from the Hypercube available on our NOKO 210 Bandcamp, and there are 2 tracks from the newer work Enoch 21, and we'll be supplementing those with back catalogue releases in the next 2 to 3 months, hopefully, as well.
Yeah, well, we'll release Selection 2 and Selection 3 from the Hypercube, which will, I imagine, be seven recordings in each for your listening pleasure.
Yeah, and there's one more as well that is yet to be released from Enoch 21. There'll also be a release of the first of 4 of the works from our Solar Cycle series, which is Ra, Golden Joy of the Sun. The first of those works, Dawn Meditation, will be seeing the light of day as well pretty soon. Yeah,
well, we've got an extensive back catalogue, and we're endeavouring to be proactive in making that material available in the next year or 2. So...
yeah, the Hypercube was a bit of a long road, and certainly we had a couple of opportunities that went by the wayside where we thought there was going to be an earlier release, but we're doing our best to make up for that now and get the works out for people. Yeah.
So with this interview, this first...
we've got one more news thing.
Okay,
we
sure.
did play at the Experiment.
Right.
That was Jay Katz and Miss Death, regular kind of variety night in Darlinghurst, and we were playing there. David Thrussell did a solo set as well, and they usually have other kind of exciting lectures and acts and films and so forth happening.
Yeah, well, they used to run the MUSE on Archive as well. Right, I mean, these
they've been doing
Sydney pioneers of all things strange, fascinating, and the rest. So I just wanted to kind of give some context to this broadcast, and that is that I wanted to do a interview with Scott concerning all things musicological and related, and so I've kind of drafted up some questions. So I'm going to just read the questions out and let Scott rap, and I might sort of interject a few times, and so let's go.
Yeah, some of these areas are quite complex, so detail will be covered in subsequent, discussions. It won't all be covered, totally.
Yeah, so I mean, we'll be dealing more with the musicological aspects and references and some various other kind of related topics. And further down the track, we'll be talking about more specifically the esoteric and occult process that's involved in our research project. But let's begin. So, Scott, how would you describe the sound of NOKO 210 to someone who hasn't heard of the group or seen us perform live?
I think the sound is most obviously characterised by your vocal, usually working with elements from the Enochian system in some way or other. There would be usually synthesized timbres or samples being used. Often the sound would have a kind of minimalist feel to it. It might have a hypnotic kind of edge to it. It might be fairly trance-inducing. It might be sometimes sounding new age. The main point with the sound is that basically any kind of sound could turn up in some form as part of what we're doing. The concept behind that originating from working specifically with the Enochian is the unifying feature, as well as Barry's ritual articulation of the works. As the most generic label you could give would be experimental, new age, or dark ambient. But then again, there's works that sound like they're referencing TV theme music, or even the idea of computation or machine sounds themselves. Sometimes there's some music concrete sounds, direct recording of physical objects generating the timbres for the work. Sometimes the works have a very prescribed feeling, where you can see, well, the data has been taken from the occult materials, and you can definitely get a feeling that it is some kind of output of numerical content. Other times I'll be using other compositional techniques or devices where the data informing those processes is not as apparent to a listener, or may be entirely contained within Barry's delivery, where I've used some other kind of compositional device constructing that particular work.
Great, right. Where do you see NOKO 210 situated in the context of the Western musical tradition in style and genre?
Yeah, I think ultimately, as an untrained musician, technically, anything I do really has to be called folk music, in the same way that rock and roll or hip hop or dance music or other, popular forms of music are often created by people with no classical or formal training. Within that, I've already covered a little bit in the last question, but you could say overall a genre would be electronica, ambient, or new age would probably be the headings that we would fit under the most easily for people, I think.
Scott, you've often discussed some of your primary influences from the early 20th century classical experimental through minimalism and onto computer-generated modes of composition. Would you care to share with us some of these figures so we might get an idea of the musical influences which have shaped your approach to a composition?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a bit more of a complex one that will probably be addressed in more detail. I was fairly excited about aspects of 20th century compositional technique when I first found out about them in my teens, including things like serialism, the tone row, various uses of prescriptive ways of constructing and manipulating musical kind of phrase to generate composition, where the serialists would use mathematical transformations of various motifs and fairly prescribed or even algorithmic, in a literal sense, processes to generate their content. The other side to that kind of prescription that I also enjoyed was the introduction of the more aleatory elements typified by, say, Cage's use of the I Ching, or other elements into his own performative or compositional kind of excursions. Also inspiring, obviously, from the earlier period, in the 40s, the extensive use of electronics in both live performance and the starting of the exploration of the studio as the creative technology. Moving on to composers like Stockhausen, obviously, the mediation of electronics and the curation of various electronic and live instruments was a very important change in his expression of live music. Also, he was very pioneering with a lot of the technological things he was doing. Inspiring also to me is the use of the larger mainframe systems, the RCA system used by Babbitt, and the people who struggled with those early interfaces and explorations of producing musics of any kind with computational systems. I was also very interested in the emergence of conceptual framework around things like Fluxus regarding the production of both performance and sound, and the freeing of sound from conventional instrumentation. I guess that's very much a futurist kind of thing too. The idea of the ambient noise or various found materials producing musical timbres. Long durational kind of composition produced by people like Lamont Young and Terry Riley. Also, I found very interesting the idea of a durational space that was very extended, where an audience may only witness part of the work, and where definitely a psychological experience of the work transcended a usual listening response to a piece, possibly. Also, the use of technologies, the use of tape loop and tape manipulation as well by some of those artists, I find very interesting also. Other things informing my creative process come from the world of materials science and the world of math also. I find a lot of interest in physical processes as being analogous to various things I could create, or ideas to do with machines, virtual machines I could build. It's inspiring, the kind of work of people like Stephen Wolfram, describing various near-periodic kind of systems, outputting a variety of patterns. The Tridex MUSE, partially created by Marvin Minsky, which was a composition generator. There was an analog computing device and logic device. In some ways, that's an extension of the logic gate work created earlier by Stanley Lunetta, or maybe just it evolved in parallel to those ideas. Cellular automata as well, the idea of automated systems that produce ongoing patterns of an indefinite duration. And with some of the NOKO compositions, they are in fact short segments of a process that could go on indefinitely, basically, as well.
Well, thanks for that, Scott. I think it might be pertinent to mention, for example, the Hypercube, which is the culmination of many years of working with the Enoki magical system by NOKO 210, and the various aspects of the Enochian system, from the watchtowers to the Aethers. Specifically, our focus has been for over 2 decades the Enochian alphabet itself. The Hypercube 210 could be considered in many respects NOKO 210's magnus opus, consisting of 21 separate compositions, one for each letter of the angelical alphabet or Enochian alphabet. Their length ranged from 15 minutes to in excess of 40 minutes. Given these compositions are often directly informed by the content of numerical structures inherent of the alphabet itself, or the permutations thereof, for example, could you discuss how this work might come together?
The NOKO work for the Hypercube There are consistent methodologies that we'd follow. We'd get together and have a discussion about deriving, well, Barry rather would derive the kind of numeric and data content that we needed from the materials. We'd have a discussion about how we were feeling about what kind of tool sets I was going to bring to the table, and how Barry felt about various vocal treatments that may work with things that I was doing. I'd take those informations away and I would make decisions around how the data was going to be used. In some cases, that may be a very prescriptive algorithm that outputs, a series of elements. It may be something that has elements of self-patterning or randomization within the use of those data. So I'd be recording possibly a different outcome every time I ran that script. I would take these source materials that I had collated, and Barry and I would then get together and Barry would lay out the ritual space. We would then go through and work through different sections of that ritual process and work on the vocal that was going to work with various sections, sort out the structure, and once we were satisfied with that, we would go ahead and perform the ritual and document the ritual with a recording of that process. And then Barry would record, journal any outcomes with that, and we'd also do some photo or video documentation of the space.
Yeah, I think it's important to point out that it is part of a larger magical operation, and that and a research project. So and that also it's worth pointing out that sometimes and many times these rituals would be performed over a period of time, many times, not just once. NOKO 210 sound typically exhibits largely electronic instrumentation, even where traditional instrumental timbres are represented. Can you speak a little bit about some of the factors informing the orchestration of the work?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my main kind of interest is in working with synthesis on a variety of platforms. Often that would involve deliberate synthesis of an acoustic sounding timbre. That's something that I enjoy working on a lot. Definitely there is a limitation involving the access to groups of instrumentalists. There are some cases where ideally, yes, if I had access to a group of players to respond to a score, that would be the right thing to do. Most of the time, I'm actually wanting to be working with synthesized timbres or samples or other things instead. So don't think that anything you hear from NOKO is basically something that should be being rendered with orchestral instruments or live instruments. And in some ways too, any time you pick up a particular instrument or you turn to a particular software environment or hardware synthesis engine, what you're going to be doing is being structured by the limitation of that architecture. I mean, less so with a computational environment because it's a fairly open playing field of things to do. But even within that, there are things that are easier to do and things that are harder to do. So I think the idea of deliberately or just through happenstance limiting palette is a really strong thing to bring out compositional necessity. Having to work within that and produce things, I think, is a very useful thing, and it's natural. I mean, if you pick up an acoustic instrument, you can only play scales so high. It has a limited register, it has limits of the physical interaction with that instrument that other instruments, for example, would not have.
In NOKO 210, you use a range of hardware synthesizers and software in the sonic production process. Could you walk us through some of these machines and examples of their usage historically and talk a little bit about them? And also, could you elaborate on the software that you use?
Yeah, sure. That's a very, very big subject area, and we'll probably cover some specifics of using different tools and different synthesis engines when we're discussing aspects of various works. I've been a big fan of synthesis for a lot of years. I work with a wide range of synthesis platforms. I mean, most people are familiar with analog synthesis, a pure electronic signal path, and that's something that's always fun to work with. I don't have a big modular rig or any kind of modular at the moment, but I'll be starting to work with that again soon. I enjoy FM synthesis, which is a very rigorous, very complex kind of ground-up way of building sounds, typified by things like the Yamaha DX7 and FS1R, kind of synthesizers. Recently, there's been a lot of smaller FM units coming out. People are really excited about FM, I think, again. Virtual analog machines simulating analog synthesis processes are very, very good these days too, and there's a lot of virtual analog machines out there from many manufacturers. I've also still got an original K2000 Kurzweil machine, which is something which is always fun to sample on and has some very good modulation architecture that, even though it's an antique machine, can certainly bring some interesting artifacts out occasionally also. Software, I totally endorse the Chuck software environment. That's the main thing I use. Other useful packages I would think are things like Plug Bidgel, Super Collider. There's a lot of different environments where you can do virtual synthesis and sequencing and build all kinds of audio machines. Pure Data, another good one, which is the free version of the Max environment. Yeah, I mean, we live at a time where the amount of computational power available to someone who isn't the head of a university department is just phenomenal. I definitely have no concerns about the availability of the machines and the power of the machines that I have today to work with compared to 20 years ago even. It's the best time to be working with electronics and synthesis and music as far as I'm concerned.
So we've been working together collaboratively for over 20 years now, and being such a specific area of composition, do you think that you'll run out of things to write musically?
Definitely not. Even when you and I sit down and talk about some of the projects we'd like to do in the future, there's just so much to explore and so many things to work with. It's more about choosing which ones you have time to complete in the next however many years, rather than scratching around. What are we going to do today? We've run out of things to do.
What can we get out of it? What can we squeeze out in this incarnation?
Yeah. So it's never something I'm concerned about. I mean, if I ran out of things to do with NOKO, I could always start up, doing a side project as well, doing some other electronic thing. But no, there's just a wealth of materials to work with, and it's like I say, it's about the limitation of the time we have available to engage with these works.
During our career collaborating with NOKO 210, we've not really performed very much compared to our overall work output. That being said, we've had some notable performances over the years in Australia and abroad, including just the aforementioned one like Significant Dark Mofo. These include the Equinox Festival London, the Australian Arts Biennale, the Esoteric Book Conference Seattle, the Fringe Festival Australia, iMage London, and regional touring shows Windows to the Sacred. From these shows, what are some of your favourite performances live with NOKO?
Look, I've enjoyed, I think, every performance that we've done, unless we've had some kind of technical problem or there's been something else external that's been making it less than easy in some way. All of the regional shows were fantastic with the Fringe stuff. Biennale, just an amazing live environment to work in, and we had Michael Strum doing some live video mixing.
That was curated by Jack Sargent too.
Oh, the Biennale one, that's
Yeah,
right,
yeah,
exactly,
yeah.
The Seattle and the London ones, for various reasons, both very, very exciting. The Tasmanian one, because it was a chance for us to actually do a longer inhabiting of an installation space, which has always been one of our primary goals.
Yeah, well,
that was the other thing that made it such an
reflects,
achievement, to have that duration to work in.
Yeah, the duration.
Space.
It kind of reflects an ideal representation of what we would do naturally. It's more intimate, like, to how we work.
Yeah.
Durational, generating art, being in a space that's set up in a ritualized way, having the documentation and research presented. So, I think that show really showcased and was, probably the closest we've come to an ideal presentation of what NOKO 210 is and does. And
I think in some ways it was one of the best locations for an audience to engage, because they had the 2D materials, they had research materials being presented
they could get
to
it,
look at. They had the live performances.
And, large part of that goes down to the curation by Brendan Walls.
Absolutely.
Who I think did a fantastic job overall. Yeah. And I think that, and it was something that was noticed by Stephen Romano in New York, who noted that that exhibition contextualized that aspect of your work very effectively. It was clear, it was concise, and it made sense. People got it. Yeah, and I think that's been, Yeah,
the whole Invisible House as an element of Dark Mofo was a very exciting thing to include. The things that Brendan drew together in the Invisible House, from Jan with the traditional kind of occult
magical tattooing.
Blood
and ink flowing for days.
That's right. The collection.
With chance.
The Romano photographic collection.
The William Mortensen. That people love those.
Yeah.
And Brandon Walls' installation Tohu v Bohu, with the extended long performances on the second weekend as well.
Well, he was doing like 12-hour durational performances. It was the closest thing that I had actually participated in that that seemed like something related to works happening from the 60s. It was a very intense.
Those types of fluxus and various other sort of performative things were a great influence upon you and me, even back at art college. What kind of response do you get when we perform or present the work live?
We usually get a very positive response. A lot of the times we're performing, there is an educated audience who has deliberately sought out the performance as something they have a pre-existing interest in. So I think that's one of the reasons. But even someone who was not familiar with the concept of the work or any associated kind of materials.
There's enough associative cues there to, I think, point people in a direction that
they enjoy it as a physical experience of the sound in space and the ritual articulation, and a lot of people certainly reported that they had some psychological
and
experiences,
somatic kind of experiences as well.
Trance experiences, ecstatic experiences. I don't remember anyone saying they had a negative experience, but possibly they did. I don't know.
I think we've. Well, we might have caused a small amount of controversy, very small, from the most unlikely of places. But that being said, I think that I particularly enjoyed two old ladies coming up to us after one of the Fringe performances. I think it was the Iris Cinema at the Adelaide Fringe Festival, and who had bought tickets, and they were actually opera aficionados, and they were really delighted and said it was. I think they said it was a primal opera, and I thought that was like really hitting the mark. I was pretty happy with that. But I think there's there's a few reviews and different things out there, and that go into that sort of stuff.
Totally.
So.
Speaking of which, we forgot to mention the exciting feature by Amy Hale in the Speculative Arts magazine.
Yes, that's correct.
Which is a quarterly, is it? The
Well, I
Speculative
don't know, but the Speculative Arts research publication is a relatively new publication, and I think it's edited by Alessandro Keegan and Max Rado. And in volume 2, which is online, it's free online. Volume 2, there's an article about the performance aspect of our work, and so that can be found at speculativeartsresearch.com, Journal 2. And I think it's The Blissful Company of Demons, The Performative Dynamics in the Art of Barry William Hale. That's the name of the article. And Amy, we met Amy at the performance that we did at the Esoteric Book Conference in Seattle, and she was one of the speakers, and she was moderating a panel on esoteric art that I sat on as well. And she's an academic, and she's written extensively. Has on ethel cocoon just recently. There's been something published by Fulger, and she's working on some other projects. And she took an interest in aspects of the performative aspects of NOKO. And over the past few years, we've been having a nice long conversation between her, myself and Scott, and she presented a paper on the performance art. I think it was in, I can't remember the exact name, I think it was in California, San Francisco. Anyway, you can check that out. It's a great article. It's a great new magazine. So it was really good to be in the pages with, there was Paul Laffrey and a whole bunch of other people. So I think people really well worthwhile checking that one out. So when someone thinks of NOKO in the recording studio, Scott, is it like glass booths and a giant mixing console in the next room?
No. NOKO is more about a field expedient live recording situation. Wherever we have the space to set up the ritual workspace and whatever equipment is needed for that particular recording session. That could be a very small area in a garage, depending where one of us is living and what spaces are available. I used to have a space underneath a house which had a lot of work area available all the time. That was something where it was permanently set up.
Yeah, that was great.
We've worked in very, very small spaces, and often in less than ideal recording environments. Listening back to some of the recordings, it's amazing often how well those turn out, considering the reflective nature or the unusual, non-ideal spaces that we were working in.
How do you feel about contemporary music, Scott? And do you listen to the radio or streaming music services?
Oh, look, I listen to my own music collection sometimes. I like a range of different genres. I sometimes listen to things that friends have pointed me to that are more contemporary that they think I might find interesting. A lot of the time I'm listening to podcasts with people talking or authors talking about a book or various subject matters, and I'm not necessarily listening to music streams because I guess part of it is that I'm in the studio a fair bit of the time, and I maybe just want a bit of a break from listening to audio in that way. I don't know.
There's been quite a lot of interest in electronic voice phenomena in the past few years, and the use of technology as a bridge between magic and the paranormal Such publications like Strange Frequencies, The Extraordinary Story of the Technological Quest for the Supernatural, and High Static Deadlines, which charts the histories of paranormal culture. These have served to illustrate an increase of interest, but in reality, this is no new news. And the use of technology in this context goes back to antiquity and has constantly been a coupled companion. I'm aware that your interest in this subject goes way back. So could you talk a little bit about that, and could you also talk about how these factors figure in your work?
Oh yeah, totally. Basically, the EVP or electronic voice phenomena and ITC, which is instrumental transcommunication, are related subjects. EVP usually relates to the idea of disincarnate, disembodied voices manifesting on recording equipment or through electronic devices such as radio receivers or anything else that could produce some kind of signal. Instrumental transcommunication extends to devices like computers, where communication could be mediated through a text or, audio or some other kind of, response. I guess ITC could include the idea of reading random number generators for deviation under a variety of circumstances. Maybe it even includes the idea of a psychic or a psi phenomena affecting a thermometer in a vacuum chamber through means other than apparently physical. EVP, to my mind, is a technological extension of the interests of the spiritualism starting up around the 1840s, I think. Obviously, the table tapping, mediumship, channeling, and the Ouija board were various methodologies whereby people were saying they were establishing communication mostly with deceased humans, not with preternatural entities like the contactee movement or something from a later period, but not too different in some of their methodologies either. Edison, I think, captures it well when he says, if the spirits were only capable of subtle influences, a sensitive recording device would provide a better chance of spirit communication than the table tipping and Ouija boards mediums employed during his time. So the idea is basically that an electronic device is an easier method for something that does not have a lot of energy available to make a communication apparent to people in this realm. We see a similar thing, for instance, with the new technology of photography, which was also being touted to capture spirit images. In fact, any new technology, you can pretty much guarantee humans may construct it as a bridge to the afterlife or communicating with spirits. And if they're not doing that, they're going to be carrying a chunk of it around in their pocket, thinking it gives them some kind of life extension or health benefit. For instance, radium or phosphate, when they were first popularised, were often seen as health beneficial in some way. The other intersection of the technology and the paranormal is obviously the investigations into psi energy, where things like random number generators are examined for potential influence by psychics or the power of prayer or by other kind of phenomena. I think there's even things where statistics relating to internet search are seen as somehow foretelling future trends. So I think there's a lot of investigation around different internet kind of statistics as well these days for that sort of thing, but I'm no expert on those. The Raudevey was, Constantine Raudevey was one of the early exemplars of making huge amounts of recordings onto tape involving his communication allegedly with deceased spirits. He wrote a book, The Electronic Communication with the Dead, and released recordings. These are quite popular materials. Sarah Estep, in 1982, established the American Association of EVP, which is still going, I believe, today, investigating those kind of interests. These days, the use of spirit or ghost boxes is very popular. There are huge kind of communities which, like the popularisation of the ghost hunting by the TV shows, this is a very pop culture thing these days to have an interest in. And if you listen to the work of someone, for example, like Bill Hauser, he's using often a modified AM radio with a feature where he can control the scanning across the station frequencies and the speed of that scanning to create those kind of synchronous intersections between sounds and words that are then often interpreted as responses to his questioning. In terms of the composition relating to the NOKO project, which obviously deals with esoteric systems and the ideas and philosophies around influence in this realm from a variety of other locations, could suggest that by creating algorithms that work with permutation or aleatory kind of outcomes, it could be suggested that that operates as an opportunity or a space whereby a particular energy could influence or partake in the outcomes of those kind of processes, I guess, is the most succinct way to look at it in relation to that kind of work.
Yeah, well, I mean, we'll delve deep into those areas in more specific relationship to the occult processes and methodologies that we use in further broadcasts from RADIONOKO. Do you think NOKO has a appeal to a wide audience, or is it one more of a specialised taste?
Look, these days I think a consumer public for music is exposed to a huge range of different genres. I think people are very engaged with the idea of music that serves a function psychologically for meditation, for example. I think people are used to having quite experimental sounds overlaid with a 4/4 beat in dance music, and a younger generation is not perturbed at all by kind of any sound they might hear as part of a music composition, or maybe some of them are, which is different to a context of, say, the 40s, where experimental music, the sounds of experimental music, were often quite at odds with standards and mores of music aesthetic of the time.
Yeah, well, I suppose there's one thing that comes in a little bit later, is the use of synthesizers in film soundtracks. So the association with a lot of times those sounds are associated with paranormal or science fiction.
Okay, yeah. Well, that is very much the history of the emergence of the electronic into the pop culture sphere, where those alien or unfamiliar sounds represent the other. You're absolutely right.
Yeah, from the theremin up.
Yeah, absolutely. Theremin, Forbidden Planet, the whole lot.
Sometimes people are more used to what would be considered more experimental music, or from movie soundtracks, sounds that are associated with movie the soundtracks. They're actually, in that context, they're quite familiar with some.
Oh yeah, and also remember, video game is a big platform as well for atmospheric and ambient sound direction. I mean, possibly more important than film in some ways, certainly more hours of it going into the experience the person is having with that. But that's...
I suppose, that kind of, I suppose there's more narrative direction in a movie, whereas like a video game might be more, I don't know, is it like...
Look, it's still informing atmosphere, it's still informing expectation, and subtly manipulating, I guess not in a malicious way, but, informing, I guess is a better word, informing the person's experience of that part of the narrative and their interaction with it. With all that said, I assume that someone can come to a NOKO performance and relate to it as something aesthetically interesting, without knowing anything about the concepts of data sonification without knowing anything about the Enochian system, without knowing anything about magical tradition or occult tradition.
All right. Could you tell the listeners what NOKO 210 has planned in the near future? Like any mention of some projects or any other significant dates and release of recordings?
Well, I don't think we've got any significant dates other than the Sitsky, works where you'll be giving the lectures. That's probably the closest to a fixed date event involving anything to do with us.
Yeah, there's a couple of things on the boil, but I don't want to get to
no. Well,
for performing at a major thing in Sydney. But I'm sort of like, until you know how these things go.
Well, we've volunteered to do some audio work.
That's right.
For
we have
a Rite of Venus.
the Rites of Ulysses, Rite of Venus at
I don't know where that'll be happening.
Oceania Lodge and locally.
Yep, so that'll be a lot of fun.
All right, well, that's almost a wrap, but can you tell us, tell the listeners if NOKO 210, or what NOKO 210 has planned for the near future, and any releases or performances or etc.?
Yeah, I think we mentioned already working on the next drop for the Hypercube.
That's right.
Works online, so there'll be probably another 6 or 7 released in the next 3 months, I'm hoping.
Yeah, Selection 2.
Selection 2, and also possibly the third component for the E21 might also
Enoch 21.
Enoch 21.
Yep. Which
has
been completed.
Well, that work's completed and mastered. The first in the solar cycle work, the Dawn Meditation, is Ra, Golden Joy of the Sun, the solar cycle work.
Getting all down with the solar god, or the course, the flow.
Yeah, so the first one of those is Dawn Meditation, and that's almost ready for release now. We'll be starting to work on the second one in the next couple of weeks or so, depending on our schedules. I don't know about any other. We've got a special work that's in progress that we're not disclosing information about now. That's an exciting one, but we'll talk more about that in the next
future
few months.
podcasts.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, there you go. Well, there's plenty more to come, and I think we can sign out from the first broadcast from Radio Noko and all things NOKO 210.
Yeah.
And I'm Barry William Hale, and
I'm Scott Barnes. Thank you for listening.
And we are NOKO. 10 to 10. Bye.
Bye-bye.